Right, I hope I've now got an audience, and I hope you can see my screen. As it says on there, my name is Dave Wilson. I'm been the Director of Recruitment and Admissions in Cardiff now for 6 or 7 years, and it's my privilege really to be able to come and talk to you this morning. And my apologies for the delay. There's been some technical issues. So what I want to do is quickly go through some things that you might need to consider when you're thinking about applying to medicine. We just heard in the breakfast session, Dinesh and Tista talking about their motivations. And one of the things I think I would encourage anybody to do is read the book that was written, the compilation that was put together recently by Adam Kay, dealing with, if you like, the thank yous that went to the NHS during this time of the COVID pandemic. And as you can see, they're a pretty wide group of people, from Peter Kay, Ed Sheeran, Katerina Johnson Thompson, and Malala Yousafzai, and they've all had really, really useful things to say about their interaction with the NHS and the people that care within the NHS. Now, if you're thinking about going to med school, it's probably a difficult time at the moment. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Med schools are struggling to manage their admissions processes, but I don't want to put you off. The thing that you need to remember is that there has been an increase in the number of medical schools over the past few years, and that's increased capacity by about 25%. But concomitant, or at the same time as that, there has been a significant increase in the number of applicants. So what's driving those applicants is anybody's guess, but the fact is that that's what's going on. So I don't want to give you false hope or indeed discourage you, but it's quite a competitive world out there at the moment. So just bear that in mind. As I say, there's a lot of medical schools to choose from. There's 41 throughout the UK. Some of these are new. They were introduced by Jeremy Hunt some years ago, and they're just getting their feet under the table. I examined one, and they've just completed the second year of the course. So some of these are really quite new. So what do you want to think about? Well, you can think about a lot of things. How far is away from your folks might be one of the things that will determine where you want to go. But the more usual considerations are things like, well, is it a city or is it a campus? Cardiff, for example, is a city. It's a capital city. You get all the benefits of the capital, but you also sometimes get the downsides, the cost of accommodation, things like that. But the other side of that is campus, and if you went to Brighton, Sussex, it's a campus, and it's a bit remote. Lancaster's the same; it's a bit remote from anywhere, but it has its own benefits. Size, as I've already said, some of the new med schools are only about 100 students. Cardiff, by comparison, has got 300 students as an intake each year. You may be interested in things like rankings, and I have to say, I think there's a lot of nonsense talked about these rankings, but it may influence you, and that's your prerogative. More importantly, perhaps, is the course type. Medicine can be taught in a whole variety of different ways, and over the 40 years of my experience, I've been involved in most forms of teaching medicine. And I think the issue for me is always about identifying what way you learn as an individual and what suits your learning style. You need to think about that perhaps and reflect on what is the best type. Now, for example, I will give you a heads up. There are still some old courses, and I say old because that's the old traditional way of teaching, and that's sitting, students in a lecture theatre and doing essentially what I'm doing now, and that's talking at the audience. And that can be okay, but it isn't the best way of learning. It doesn't engage you quite the same. You write your notes, you file them away, and then some months later you might dig them out to revise them for an exam. And that's perhaps something that you want to think about. That might suit your learning style, it may not. But anyway, accommodation. Now, accommodation, some med schools offer accommodation for incoming first-year medical students, some don't. That's something to think about. It's also the cost of the accommodation. What the union or medical schools have a students' union attached to them, and the facilities therein are important, because you've got to be able to relax and do the things that all other students do besides doing the medical course. You might want to think about the transport links. It's no point going to Aberdeen if you live down in Truro, because you're going to spend most of your time travelling to and from your home. It's going to take a long time. Now, the other thing is that many of you will perhaps know people that have gone to medical school or have visited a medical school recently. And it's often useful to have a chat with them and see what their view of the medical school is. And one of the things that I get recurrently told from Cardiff is people visit us, and one of the things they find is that we're a very friendly bunch of people, and that tends to suit certain people, and it's a recommendation that's often made about Cardiff. Sometimes you need to think about the course length, and this doesn't seem immediately obvious when you're 17 or 18 thinking about medicine as a career. Most med schools do offer the option of it being a 5 or 6 years, and the 6th year is really what's called an intercalated year, and this is a year you can take out midway through your medical studies to do a year of research, and that can be on pretty much any sort of topic within the scope of the university. Some are compulsory. So, for example, Edinburgh has recently moved to a 6-year program where the intercalated year is built in. UCL has had that model, and the University College London has had that model, their medical school has had that model since year 2000. That's the most important thing for you as a sort of pragmatic decision is, well, what are the entry requirements? What do I have to get in? And allied to that is, or do I need work experience, and what amount of work experience are they stipulating as a requirement for entry into the medical school? And on your UCAS form, which is the way that you apply to medical school in the UK, you can pick up to 4 medical schools. So it's important you sort of get a short list of 4 and think about that. Things like interview types, that's a bit further down the road, whether how they actually select you at interview. Perhaps the most important thing is if you're able, and I know in these times of COVID that's not easily dealt with, but how does it feel? And you can get a feel in some respects by visiting their online resources. Most universities and med schools now have quite a lot of online resources to give you an impression. Okay, you will only see, if you like, the best side of the thing, but at least you'll get some idea of what the city, the campus, whatever it might be, feels like. I won't rehearse this too much because there's a lot of talk about this, but in essence, you've got really one of 2 sorts. You've got the traditional one, which I've already talked about, the sort of heavily lecture-based preclinical, so a lot of science is loaded into the early 2 years, followed by the clinical years, but increasingly medical schools are moving to what are called either case-based learning or problem-based learning. Now these are similar, there are differences, but they tend to be small group work, so staff, like I facilitate teaching in small groups, so you get to know, in my case, 10 students per semester really quite well. You know their lives and what's going well and what's not going so well. And it's similar in the PBL. And I won't rehearse the distinction here because that's something you can research yourselves. Most courses now, though, are integrated. So what they do is they make sure, like Cardiff did about 7 or 8 years ago, is make sure that the context of the learning is put around a patient. Because in all honesty, without it being patient-centered and understanding what the patient needs and desires are, all the learning, if you like, is kind of seems fairly remote from the patient and the treatment that patient needs. Right, this is the top tips that Dave always gives, so I'll give it to you now, and this is the latest one. There is one really good source of information, and if it's the only thing you remember from this talk, it's the URL to the Medical Schools Council, and within that site you will find this document. It's available as a PDF or as a searchable online resource, and it lists all the medical schools in the country and all the entry requirements for those medical schools. So that's really where you should start. Go and have a look at this, peel through, see what they say about all the different requirements, and then you can then make your shortlist perhaps of the medical schools you're interested in. So that's a very, very useful resource. Now, the one thing that I say about this, and I would not recommend things unless they were accurate, they're free to all, which is very important these days, but most importantly, the information there is endorsed by all the UK medical schools. It's not somebody, interpreting what we say. It's what we say, and we give that information to the Medical Schools Council, and they compile this document. So as I say, it's the only thing you remember, and if you're interested in applying to medicine, this is the place to start. There are other resources there, and they've just recently linked up and created this resource for those that are thinking of other medical related courses like dentistry and pharmacy. Now, you might have wondered why there's not nursing and other things there, but that's an issue you might want to take up with the people that created this. So there's this studying healthcare resource, which again has lots of useful information. If we look at the Medical Schools Council site, and there are these info sheets they call them. Obviously, this is far too small to read. But what it does here is it tells you some very brief outline of the differences, for example, between medical schools. So that's one info sheet. Nice condensation of, if you like, all the information that you might need to understand the differences between medical schools. So, and there's what I really like is the bottom corner. It says test yourself. So you can do these little exercises, test how you're considering the issue of the differences in the medical schools. Similarly, understanding medicine, what you know about the medical course, what you know about the profession, things like that. And so, again, at the bottom corner there's a test yourself box. These used to be privileged bits of information, but now anybody can do this. Any student who's interested in medicine can go and get access to this information and try these things out for themselves and get an understanding from them. There are these info shorts, and I'm old, but I don't use video much, but they've moved with the times, and this is Fiona Watson, my counterpart up in Liverpool, and Fiona's talking in a very short clip about what makes a good doctor. And there's a number of these little video clips that tell you about the important aspects of considering the application to medicine. This is where you find it, and it's not always the most easy site to navigate. You go to studying medicine, and then you can find, for example, the medical school admissions info shorts under that tab that's indicated there. Okay, so what are med schools looking for? Well, they're looking for two things, and unfortunately, I was reading a book the other day that was published in 1987, which, for most of you seems like the dark ages, but it was a guy lamenting, who was a GP, who was lamenting the fact that his son didn't get an offer a place in med school. And he was saying that so much is stacked, if you like, in terms of the cognitive, your brains, your ability to pass exams. So much is stacked in that they tend to overlook the things, the non-cognitive skills. What you like working in a team. Are you balanced in your judgment? What's your observational skills like? Are you a good time manager? Things like that. And what med schools are challenged with repeatedly is trying to meld these two aspects of what they're looking for into a process, into an admissions process that then will enable students to, applicants to both represent themselves in terms of their non-cognitive abilities as well as the cognitive. So the top tip from Dave would be, hey, all the stuff about your cognitive abilities is listed in your exam results on the UCAS form. The way you tell them about your non-cognitive abilities is that personal statement. The key there is to get something that you can talk sensibly about in terms of describing those skills that are your personality and so-called transferable skills. So if we look at the cognitive qualities, and I don't want to rehearse this, medical schools will choose you based upon things like GCSE grades and or admissions tests. And so, for example, Cardiff, we're unusual. We take mostly only consideration of your GCSEs. We ask you for your best 9, for example. We score those, and then we decide whether we're going to interview you. Now, this year, for the first time ever, we've had to use the UCAT to separate out the students. So we've had to layer on another because we were just overwhelmed by the number of applicants. Some will use another admissions test, and these are simply, so I think it's about 6 or 7 or maybe 8 medical schools use the so-called BMAT. Now, the other alternative is you can wait, do your A-levels, get your A-levels in your back pocket, because that's the determinant of whether you're going to get accepted by most med schools, and apply in the gap year following your A-levels. Now, a lot of people seem to be in a hurry to get to their med school places, but in the current climate, maybe that route might suit your thoughts. Now, it was interesting when Dinesh was talking earlier about the situation in Australia. He did a law degree first, Then he went on to do medicine. And that's not uncommon in places like Australia, and it's certainly very common in the US. In fact, virtually, I think, if not all medical programs in the US are graduate entry. They do a first degree beforehand, and then they go and do the medical degree. And there are options within the UK to do this. I think there's now 15 medical schools that take so-called graduate entry students. And so in a sense, what it's saying is if you haven't done brilliantly in your A-levels, there is still the opportunity, if you do well in your degree, to then still get into medicine. So I hope that that gives you a feel that there are different levels at which you can things. I'm not naive. Clearly, if you apply with a degree, you'll have done 3 years and student funding and all that's gone with it. Then you do another 4 years. So it's effectively taking you 7 years, whereas in other situations it would have been 6 or 5. So check the requirements, and the source, as I said, that you need to look at is that document I raised from Medical Schools Council. So these are the things you want to think about. Am I people focused? And one of the questions in the chat earlier was, how do we show we're people focused? Well, it's volunteering. You know, still at my age, you know, I'm involved. I just did a run to something called the Rainbow of Hope. You know, I normally help feed the homeless in Cardiff. That's had to fall by the wayside with the pandemic, but there's other ways that we can provide the food to these people and get it out there. But there's a whole variety, a list there, a whole range of ways that you can show your people focus. The other thing is, of course, that also rolls over into whether you've got a caring personality. And that can be made evident by what you do in the family. Do you have younger siblings that you have to babysit for mum and dad if they're out, or you know, looking after an elderly neighbour, or indeed elderly relatives that maybe granny who's losing the plot a little bit, which is happening increasingly. There's an elderly population. We need to keep an eye out for them. We've got a neighbour, she's 95 and starting to forget to take a med, so we call in and just check in to make sure she's okay. You can get some of this experience from part-time retail or other types of work, and so don't underestimate how important working in a, to keep yourself body and soul together, at least give yourself some pocket money, how much you learn about yourself. If you've had a really tricky customer, how are you going to describe that in a personal statement? So what you do is you use this thing down the bottom, and I know a lot of you teachers will have told you, oh yeah, reflection, really important. Well, it is, but it comes down to 3 things. So what happened? So what? How did you feel? So now what? What are you going to do in the future? So if you had a really antsy customer that's come in and given you a hard time, so that's the what. So what? Well, I was really angry, and I really wanted to say something back, but I didn't. And the customer calmed down and blah, blah. So what it tells you is, well, now what? Well, now what I know is if I'm getting somebody that's getting really, hacked off with me, I can deal with them by lowering my tone of voice, not getting angry, trying to deal with it the best way. And then write this down. And also, finally, things of leadership or responsibility. We all take roles on. When I was younger, I was always the bag man and the captain of the football team and all that went with that. But there's a whole range of skills that you learn from doing these school-based responsibilities. Now, I said earlier that the way that med schools use, if you like, or look at the non-cognitive skills is through the personal statement. We really have to think of something better than this. And, because we've got a paper coming out, we've done some research, I've done it with a medical student, looking at how medical schools use the personal statement. And in fact, what's surprising is many of them don't use them at all, because they tend to be formulaic. I've read thousands upon thousands in the course of my life, and they tend to follow a very formulaic, layout. A lot of what's said can't be verified. You can't check it. And even these days, there's more concern about who actually authored it, because it may not be the person who's applying. They may have, if you like, franchised it out or paid somebody to write the personal statement. So it's really important that when you come to write the personal statement, it is you that writes it, and that the things that you say ring true. That they are, if you like, internally verifiable. So you might want to think about, well, someone's going to have to be a referee for me. They have to write a reference for you from the school or college that you attend. Let's make sure that the things that you have done and you've said in your personal statement, they can verify. So there's a kind of cross check. So always think about that. Who is it? Head of sixth form, head of careers, whatever it might be that's going to write your reference, make sure they can verify the things that you said in your personal statement. Work experience is a real problem. I heard earlier that there's now something on one of the stages today about gaining work experience. And one of the things the MSc did early on in the pandemic is recognize the challenges that students would have getting work experience. So for this end, they published this guide, and within it are a number of very useful links. Some of them are provided by people like the Royal College of General Practitioners, and what you have there are really clever little video clips of an interaction between a patient and their GP, and you could almost be the fly on the wall and go, well, okay, what went well there? What was the trigger that led the GP to ask this question? What was the patient really asking? Those sorts of things. So you can reflect on it. It's almost like being in the room with the doctor and the patient without having all the inconvenience of wearing a mask, scrubbing up and going off and traveling to the local work experience place that you might have tried to organize. But have a look at that, because there's a lot of good resource there. There are lots of others as well, but this is one that I know is explicitly about medical admissions. Okay, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but this is the timeline of what the whole process involves, and I'm coming to the end now. So thankfully, the next speaker won't be, if they're a bit more tech savvy than me, they'll be able to keep to the program. But the fact is that you start on the 15th of October with your application to UCAS. Very few do it any other way. So you have to get all your ducks in a row for the 15th of October. This is when you're in year 13. They are then sent off to the med schools by UCAS. We pick them up and we look to see whether we think that you've met our academic and non-academic criteria. And that's really important, that you've targeted the right med school so that you know what their requirements were. And on that basis, we will select you for interview or not. And if you are selected for interview, you can then go away and prepare. And the interview slots generally are around any time between sort of December through to March, because med schools have had to adapt to how they do and move away from face-to-face interviews to do things online, things like that. And on the basis of the interview, you will be offered a place. Now that's a real crunch time, because it's really, really heartbreaking to have gone through all that part of the process and then not get an offer. So there's a number of things you can do. Yes, if you get an offer, great, brilliant. You then just maybe get more than one offer, and you then have this enviable position of saying, well, which one will I choose? If you don't, you can then perhaps ask for feedback on your interview performance, and we at Cardiff do generate that. And then the other thing we will say is, if you were interviewed and you weren't successful that time, then we will always consider you as a reapplicant in the future. So you can reapply, perhaps having honed the skills that were lacking when you were interviewed. So I hope that's a clear and reasonable account of the thing. And this is my final slide. It's very Cardiff centric, so my apologies for this, for that. But in a sense, what it is that, if all goes to plan, this is where you could end up graduating from a med school in 5 or 6 or 7 years' time. So thanks for your attention. I hope that was of interest, and I'll stop doing something now and call it an end. Okay, thanks now.
Thank you so much. Really useful. We have a few questions. So if you're applying to both UKCAT and BMAT medical schools, how many of each one should you pick?
Whoa, okay. Well, you're going to give yourself a big challenge doing both BMAT and UCAT. Both are quite testing things. My view would be that you should, you've got 4 choices. You've got like a backup choice as your 5th choice. So my recommendation would always be, make sure, if that's the way you want to go, perhaps 2 of each, because I hate to use this expression, but we see so much of it these days. It's like spread betting. You're covering the bases, and you're trying to make sure that you're giving yourself the best chance. I have to say, Marina, I think I would say that it's probably not a great idea, because A, it's quite expensive, doing both. There are bursaries available through both, because I've checked this out. So if you're from a widening access background or a widening participation background and you meet their criteria, you don't have to pay. So that's important to say that. But that hopefully is a reasonable answer.
Thank you so much. There's also another one about how COVID has made it hard to find work experience. What kind of things should we be doing to show our dedication to the field?
Yeah, I think I sort of covered that in the talk, but it is really, really difficult. And it's what I think is important to say here is that we are fully aware that there are students out there, applicants to medicine, who by virtue of the fact that their mums and dads might be hospital workers or GP, it's very easy for them, for their children to get access to things. And what we as a medical school have to do is say, well, is that fair? Simply, is it appropriate because their parents or their relatives have access? So what we do is we tend not to be too prescriptive. Cardiff is unusual. We don't say, well, you have to have done. Now, some will say you have to have done X number of hours of whatever. That's more of a challenge. And I think it's up to those medical schools to defend themselves in that. Maybe what I'd recommend in those circumstances is email those med schools and say, what do you think? And how would you recommend? Because I'm sure they have an answer. But I think it's don't over worry about work experience. Check the entry requirements. If there, some almost say nothing about work experience. So there is a range out there.
Okay, that makes sense. And do you have any top tips for virtual medical school interviews?
Yeah, I do. I think it's doing what we're doing now is one of them. Is if you can get yourself on a screen and see how persuasive you look, because it's really about that. It's about looking confident, thoughtful, having at least rehearsed to some level the answers that you might anticipate. It's no surprise at a medical school's interview, whether it be virtual or otherwise, to be said, well, why medicine? And you heard Testa and Dinesh this morning telling the group what their motivations were, and what the applicant needs to do is look within themselves. Don't contrive, nothing contrived. Don't say, oh, it first happened when my granny decided, da la la la, that sort of stuff. Make it believable, make it plausible and convincing. Be yourself, I think, is the one real top tip. Because trust me, I've done lots of interviews again, and these grey hairs didn't come alone, I'll tell you. And I think the most important is that you can generally tell if somebody's over-rehearsed or telling you, what they think you want to hear rather than genuinely what is the truth. And that's, you can spot that fairly quickly.
Yeah. And also, is undergrad med more competitive than grad?
That's a really interesting question. I'm not honestly sure. My guess is that they're both equally competitive, and I think that, and it rather depends which med school. Now, there are new med schools, and if you're prepared to be, want the experience of a new med school, and I would have to say, I think that's a really good experience. If you're at the front edge of a new medical course, that can be an exciting place to be. So, I don't know. My guess would be that it's less competitive at postgraduate level, because the selection criteria become more easily definable, whereas at undergrad, we're dealing with BMAT scores or UCAT scores or GCSE scores, much more difficult.
All right, and one final one. It's about, how do you know which bits are most important to keep on your personal statement and which are not really that important?
Yeah, I think what I would say is that it's all about what you've learned about yourself. Now, I can tell you, I'll give you an example, because I said I was a bagman for football. And it is the world's hardest job to ask your mates for £3 each to pay for the laundry or the pitch hire or the whatever it happens to be. And that was my job. And I found it really, really challenging to ask people for money. It's not something that I find easy to do, not in my nature. So I think it's all about those reflective things. It's about the things, not, I've read, these wonderful work experience narratives that tell me in the infinite detail about some surgical procedure. But the one thing I remember is when you hear a hip replacement and the hip being disarticulated, there is no sound on this planet. And it makes you want to reach for a bucket, because it isn't a sound that you want to hear too often, because it's just a very unusual sound. It's the hip the femoral head coming out of the hip. And so I think that's the visceral side of it, and it's that is the personal side of the personal statement, not how great you are in terms of GCSEs, because that's all in the academic side. So don't waste your time writing.
Yeah, of course, that makes perfect sense. I think that is it with all the questions. Thank you so much. That was so useful.